I saw An Inconvenient Truth at Sundance at its world premiere. And I don't know how I didn't know about climate change to that point, because I was someone who was fairly aware, I thought, clearly not aware enough. And I couldn't sleep 3 nights on, just thinking, what can you do? What can be done? It literally shifted something in me. Looking for solutions, knowing we've put too much CO2 up in the atmosphere already, how are we going to draw it down? How are we going to bring more down than we're emitting? And that was the question being asked in 2007 and 2008, so 12 and 13 years ago. And it was the way we worked with nature that was showing the potential to draw down more CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide than we're emitting. And so of those pieces of nature, it's forests. So guess what? Don't burn them down. That makes sense. Pastures, how do we deal with pastures? And then row crop production, how do we deal with row crop production? And it was the pastures that was in my research and the people I was meeting that were really showing me the biggest bang for the buck, the quickest flip of becoming from an emitter of carbon to a drawing down of carbon. So I started the Carbon Cowboys series in 2013, right when I got out here to ASU, to look at these farmers that are raising cattle and managing their cattle in a way that replicates the way herds of bison moved across the Great Plains. They're doing remarkable work on regenerating their land, getting themselves out of debt, renewing their water cycle on their land. Streams that flowed for their grandfather, dried up for their dad, are now flowing again. And so in 2013, when I started making the movies, I also learned that there was virtually no research on this type of grazing, virtually none. And any research that said it was about this type of grazing, most of it was not really about this type of grazing. So it was a big hole. And so through ASU, Arizona State University's being open-minded to let a filmmaker start a research program, we put together a team and we're really able to ask the question, can AMP grazing make the land better and the farmer more money? And very long story short, that started in 2013, 2014, and now here we are in 2020. Our data is coming in, and I can say yes to both of those questions.
What over time could take this increasingly exponential to the point where it just flips the system? Do you have a sort of a mental model of that?
The first companies that I went to for funding for this research that we needed to get done on adaptive grazing were the energy companies, because they've got a carbon problem, and it's really just a placement situation. It's the carbon's up here and we need the carbon down here in the soil as opposed to so much of it in the atmosphere. And so it was one person at Shell back in 2013, a guy named Russ Conser, who was running Shell Game Changer at the time. He heard what I was saying about, why spend all this money on carbon capture and storage when you can spend the same money teaching ranchers how to ranch in a way that will draw down a lot more carbon than CCS and do it a lot more cost effectively. And so then what you have is you have a giant industry, and I don't think it would just be Shell. We want the entire fossil fuel industry to help this, trying to change another industry that doesn't necessarily want to change.
Yeah.
And so that was step one. Step two, what's happening in the food industry. McDonald's is our biggest funder in the research we're doing. So we have McDonald's, Shell, and then ExxonMobil and Timberland and Wrangler and other folks as well. So with McDonald's, they're realizing that their supply chain's not resilient.
Yeah.
And so soil health makes a resilient supply chain.
And your future role in all of this is as a gadfly, sort of going around and sort of biting McDonald's and people like that, or?
My job, as I see it coming forward, is to get enough farmers to change their methods so that we can draw down 1 billion tons, a gigaton of CO2 just on US farms. We want to take it throughout the world. It's educating the farmers, right? Yeah. And so that feels like a philanthropic part where we find philanthropies, foundations to help fund the great teachers that are out there. There's some great teachers, the soilhealthacademy.org, they're the best. And so how do you get those, I don't know how many teachers they have right now. They're farmers that do this sort of stuff, but we need thousands of them.
If you had your dream by, say, the early 2030s, what would be happening in the world that you don't yet see happening, and who would have helped people like you to make that happen faster and more effectively?
Well, what I see happening by the early 2030s is that many big companies have made the pledge to be carbon neutral from when they started.
Yeah.
And when they look at all the solutions they can draw from, I hope all of them are being utilized. The soils are going to offer us a huge part of that solution.
Yeah.
And if you want to be drawing down a lot of carbon into soils, you need those soils to be healthy. If you need those soils to be healthy, regenerative agriculture has to be practiced. And so in the US, it's like 1 or 2% of farmers are doing regenerative practices of some sort. If we change just the grazing by 25% towards a robust AMP grazing method, we could draw down a fifth of US CO2 annually.
Yeah.
So if you just change grazing completely in the next 10 years, we could be drawing down 4/5 of US emissions of CO2, not all the other greenhouse gases, and there's a ton that no one ever talks about, but that's significant. That's not even the row crop production. I think it's companies that are going to promote this. I think it's companies that have the wherewithal to push this. If governments come on board and have like watched what's happening and take the best rules, I know I'm sounding naive and hopeful here, but if they actually do promote like good policy, that would be fantastic. It would remove some headwind. It would remove a lot of headwind.
Yeah.
But none of our work depends on a tax or a government policy. Our work depends on farmers understanding nature, wanting the best for their land, and just not knowing that these options exist.